Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It is great to have you here with us today. We have a massive story to unpack, one that is reshaping the geopolitical landscape right before our eyes. If you have been following the headlines, you have likely seen the chaos unfolding in Switzerland. You might be wondering what exactly is going on with Donald Trump and the sudden shift in the Greenland narrative, especially while Mark Carney seems to be dominating the conversation at Davos. You might be hearing about a framework deal or a diplomatic breakthrough, but do not let those headlines fool you. What we actually witnessed was a stunning retreat. We saw a former president backed into a corner, forced to reverse course on a major international demand, and at the same time, we saw Mark Carney emerge as the unexpected voice of a new global resistance, delivering a message that completely upstaged the American delegation. Today, we are going to cut through the noise and break down exactly how this happened, why it matters, and what it means for the future of American power. Let us set the scene properly so you can visualize exactly what went down. Picture the snow-covered Swiss Alps. It is January 21st, 2026. The global elite, world leaders, billionaire CEOs, and tech moguls have gathered for the World Economic Forum. It is the kind of place where history is often written in quiet backrooms. But this year, the drama happened right on the main stage. Within a span of less than 24 hours, we witnessed two speeches delivered in the exact same venue that could not have been more different in tone, substance, or reception. One speech captured the attention of the entire world with its absolute clarity, its moral courage, and a startling new vision for the future. The other speech? Well, it essentially unraveled in real time as the speaker tried desperately to extract himself from a diplomatic crisis that was entirely of his own making. I want to tell you what actually happened behind the scenes because if you're just scrolling through your news feed, you are only getting half the story. The mainstream headlines right now are hyper-focused on Donald Trump's supposed deal. They are talking about his framework agreement regarding Greenland and his claim of a strategic victory. But I am here to tell you that is not the real story. That is the spin. The real story, the one that will be written about in history books, is how a Canadian Prime Minister walked onto that stage on Tuesday and delivered what seasoned diplomats are calling the most consequential speech by a Western leader in years. And the real story is how, less than one day later, Donald Trump stood in that very same spot and revealed something we almost never see from him, a public retreat. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to start by looking at what happened on Tuesday, January 20th, when Mark Carney took the stage at Davos. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with Carney's deep background, it is crucial to understand why this man commands absolute silence in a room when he steps up to the microphone. This is not just a politician. This is a heavy hitter in the world of global finance. We are talking about the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England. He is the only person in history to ever hold both of those positions. When Mark Carney talks about global finance, about the levers of economic power, and about how the world actually works, people who have trillions of dollars under management lean forward in their chairs and take notes. They know he is not just reading a speechwriter's draft. He understands the plumbing of the global economy better than almost anyone else alive. So, you might be asking yourself, what did he say that caused such a stir? He stood before that audience of power players and told them something they all deep down already knew, but were too afraid to acknowledge openly. He told them that the rules-based international order, the very system that has governed global relations since the end of World War II, is over. He did not say it was declining. He did not say it was weakening or under stress. He said, it is over, done, finished. We are in the midst of a rupture, Carney said. I want you to really think about that specific word choice for a moment, rupture. He did not use soft language like transition or evolution or adjustment. He called it a rupture. That implies a violent breaking apart, a sudden tearing of the fabric that has held the world together for 75 years. I'm curious what you think about that word rupture. Do you feel like we are living through a breaking point in history right now, or is this just standard geopolitical drama? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. But here's where Carney did something truly remarkable, something that separates a standard political speech from a historical moment. He did not just diagnose the problem and leave it at that. He did not offer empty platitudes about hoping for better days or finding common ground. No, he laid out a concrete strategy. And in doing so, he indirectly but unmistakably challenged Donald Trump right to his face, without once ever mentioning his name. It was a masterclass in diplomatic maneuvering. Carney spoke about how countries like Canada, and indeed much of the Western world, had operated for decades under what he called a useful fiction. This was the comforting story we told ourselves, that everyone played by the same rules, that international law mattered equally for everyone, large or small, and that the strongest nations operated with a sense of restraint and responsibility. We knew, of course, that this story was always partially false. We were not naive. Carney admitted that the strongest nations would always exempt themselves from the rules when it was convenient for them. We knew that trade rules were often enforced asymmetrically, favoring the big guys over the little guys. We knew that international law applied with varying rigor, depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. But we accepted this fiction because it provided stability. However, Carney argued that we have crossed a line, and then came the sentence that cut through the diplomatic politeness like a knife. He said, "You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination." I want you to read that line again in your mind. When integration becomes the source of your subordination. He is saying that when being connected to a larger power, economically or militarily, stops benefiting you and starts controlling you, the relationship has fundamentally changed. When partnership turns into domination, the old rules no longer apply. The room understood exactly what he was saying, and more importantly, they understood exactly who he was talking about. Carney was speaking directly to what he called middle powers. He was talking to countries like Canada, France, Germany, Australia, nations with significant economic and military capacity, dignified nations, but not nations with enough sheer mass to stand alone against the true giants of the world in a one-on-one fight. And he told them something they desperately needed to hear in that moment. He said, "If you are not at the table, you're on the menu." That line landed like a thunderclap. You could hear a pin drop because everyone in that room understood the immediate, terrifying context. At that very moment, while Carney was speaking, Donald Trump was actively threatening military action against Greenland. He was demanding that Denmark, a loyal NATO ally, surrender sovereign territory to the United States. He was threatening punishing tariffs against 8 different European nations if they did not fall in line. He was treating the Atlantic Alliance not as a partnership of shared values, but like a ruthless real estate negotiation where the landlord is trying to evict the tenants. Carney, without ever naming Trump, was telling Europe, "You have a choice. You can stand together or you can be devoured separately." He laid out exactly what Canada had been doing since he took office to prepare for this new reality. They were not just sitting around hoping things would get better. They were doubling defense spending. They were signing 12 new trade and security agreements on 4 continents in the span of just 6 months. They were drawing closer to the European Union, building what Carney called strategic autonomy, the ability to resist pressure, the capacity to say no when a superpower demands a yes. And then he addressed the elephant in the room directly. He turned his attention to Greenland. He stated clearly that Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark in their unique right to determine Greenland's future. He called the situation a test of NATO. He said Canada's commitment to Article 5, the collective defense clause that says an attack on one is an attack on all, was unwavering. And he explicitly opposed the tariffs Trump had threatened. The speech was delivered in both French and English, showcasing a statesman's versatility. It was measured, it was precise, and it was absolutely devastating. As you can imagine, the reaction from the international community was instant and electric. The British Broadcasting Corporation called it one of the best speeches by a world leader in years. Major cultural magazines praised its clarity and courage. Foreign policy analysts across Europe hailed it as exactly what the moment required. Someone finally was saying out loud what everyone had been thinking privately in the corridors of power. Now, I want you to fast forward with me less than 24 hours later to Wednesday, January 21st. Donald Trump takes that same stage. The contrast was stunning. Trump started with his usual approach, mixing humor with veiled threats, referring to the audience as friends and a few enemies. But then he pivoted to Greenland, and what followed was a performance that revealed just how badly his strategy had backfired. For weeks leading up to this, Trump had been escalating the situation. First, he said acquiring Greenland was necessary for national security. Then, when Denmark refused, he refused to rule out military force. Then he sent his son on a publicity stunt to Greenland, where they passed out political hats like party favors, which was seen as a massive insult. Then he appointed a special envoy, whose sole job was to work toward making Greenland part of the United States. Then he threatened Denmark with tariffs. Then he expanded those tariff threats to 8 European nations. He pushed and pushed, expecting them to fold. But Europe responded by doing something Trump did not expect. They unified. Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, they all stood up. They deployed troops to Greenland for joint military exercises. They claimed it was not to threaten anyone, but to defend an ally. Emmanuel Macron gave speeches saying France would not yield to intimidation. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, said Europe would remain united. The Danish foreign minister insisted that Greenland's territorial integrity was non-negotiable. Even far-right European parties that usually align with Trump pushed back on his Greenland demands because, at the end of the day, they are nationalists who believe in sovereignty. Trump had overplayed his hand. This moment of European unity is unprecedented in recent years. Do you think this unity will last? Or will they fracture as soon as the pressure eases off? I'd love to hear your take on this. And now, standing at Davos, facing a united front he did not anticipate, he had to find a way out. So he did what he always does when backed into a corner. He declared victory. Trump announced that he and the NATO Secretary General had formed the framework of a future deal on Greenland and the Arctic. Based on this framework, he said he would not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to begin February 1st. Notice the language, a framework of a deal, not a deal. A framework, the concept of a deal, as he might put it. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly was in this framework? Trump said it involved cooperation on his missile defense project. It involved mineral rights. It involved security arrangements. But when reporters pressed him on the one thing that mattered, whether the United States would gain ownership of Greenland, Trump was suddenly evasive. I did not want to say yet, he told reporters. It is complex. Complex. That is the word you use when you are backing down but do not want to admit it to your base. So let's pull back the curtain and look at what actually happened here, because the details matter immensely. Trump went to Davos demanding full ownership of Greenland, right, title, and interest. He said anything less was unacceptable. He threatened military force. He threatened economic warfare. He portrayed himself as an unstoppable force. And Europe called his bluff. Denmark did not blink. Neither did France or Germany or the European Union. They deployed troops. They prepared for the worst-case scenario. And they made it crystal clear that they would invoke Article 5 of NATO if the United States attacked Greenland. Think about what that means. It would mean the United States would be at war with its own alliance. The most successful military alliance in modern history would dissolve overnight, and America would stand alone against Europe. Trump looked at that scenario, looked at the economic devastation it would cause, and realized he had no good options. He could not actually invade Greenland without triggering a catastrophic global crisis. He could not impose tariffs without devastating the American economy, which relies on European trade. And he could not just walk away without losing face. So he negotiated what diplomats are already calling a face-saving compromise. This framework isn't about ownership. It is about cooperation. It is about enhanced security arrangements that were mostly already in place. It is about mineral development that Greenland has been seeking for years anyway. It is about coordination on Arctic defense that NATO has been discussing for months. In other words, Trump is getting what the United States already had, packaged as a new deal, so he can go home and claim victory. Crucially, he backed away from the military threat. During his Davos speech, Trump said explicitly that he would not use force. Military is not on the table, he told reporters afterward. That is not a trivial shift. For weeks, he had refused to rule out military action to keep his opponents guessing. Now, with the whole world watching, he explicitly ruled it out. That is a climb down. No matter how you frame it, no matter how much confetti you throw on it, that is a retreat. The Danish foreign minister was asked about Trump's framework announcement, and his response was incredibly telling. He said Denmark would not negotiate based on abandoning fundamental principles. We live in 2026, he said, as if reminding Trump that territorial conquest does not work the way it did in the 19th century. But here is what makes this moment historically significant. It is not just that Trump backed down. Politicians back down all the time. It is why he backed down and what that reveals about the changing nature of power in our world. For decades, American presidents could make demands and expect compliance, not necessarily through direct force, but through the sheer weight of American economic and military dominance. The rules-based order that Mark Carney described wasn't actually based purely on rules. Let's be honest, it was based on American hegemony. The United States wrote the rules, enforced them selectively, and expected deference from everyone else. And for most of the post-war period, that system worked. Allies accepted American leadership because the benefits outweighed the costs. The United States protected sea lanes. It provided nuclear deterrence. It anchored the global financial system. In exchange, allies gave Washington significant leeway on the world stage. But that bargain is breaking down, and Greenland is the moment where it became impossible to ignore. Trump assumed he could bully Denmark the way previous presidents might have pressured smaller nations. He assumed threats would produce compliance. He assumed Europe would prioritize its relationship with Washington over abstract principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. He was wrong. And Mark Carney had predicted exactly this outcome in his speech the day before. Carney said that when great powers abandon rules for transactionalism, when they try to monetize relationships, allies will diversify. They will buy insurance. They will build the capacity to resist pressure. That is exactly what happened. Europe looked at Trump's threats and realized they could not rely on American restraint anymore. So they acted. They deployed forces. They coordinated responses. They demonstrated that even middle powers, when unified, can constrain a superpower. This is the rupture Carney was describing. It is not just the end of the old order, it is the birth of something new. We are entering a world where American presidents cannot simply demand compliance. We are entering a world where alliances operate on reciprocity rather than hierarchy, where sovereignty matters even for small nations when larger ones stand with them. The irony here is rich. Trump's behavior actually accelerated this shift. His threats to Greenland did more to unite Europe than any speech or policy paper could have ever achieved. His tariff threats pushed NATO allies closer together than they have been in years. His disrespect for international law made rules-based frameworks look much more attractive by comparison. Carney understood this dynamic perfectly. That is why his speech resonated so powerfully. He was not nostalgic for the old order. He acknowledged its flaws openly. But he argued that middle powers could build something better, not by confronting great powers directly, but by cooperating with each other, by pooling sovereignty where it made sense, and by creating networks of mutual support that could resist coercion. Carney said, "The power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together." That is the key word, together. Trump's approach assumes bilateral leverage, one-on-one negotiations where the stronger party always wins, but that strategy fails when smaller powers coordinate. When Denmark is not alone, but is backed by France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada, the math changes. When resistance becomes collective rather than individual, the bully loses his leverage. And that is exactly what happened at Davos. Now, let us talk about what this means going forward. Because the Greenland crisis might be diffused for now, but the underlying tensions remain. Trump's framework deal does not resolve anything fundamental. Denmark and Greenland have made clear they are not ceding sovereignty. The details of enhanced cooperation were vague, and critically, Trump has a track record of abandoning agreements when they become inconvenient or when he changes his mind. So this could easily flare up again, especially if Trump feels humiliated by how this played out in the press. He declared victory, but everyone who was paying attention saw what actually happened. He threatened. Europe unified. He backed down. That is not the narrative Trump wanted. And presidents who feel undermined often try to reassert dominance through escalation elsewhere. But something fundamental has changed. Europe now knows it can stand up to American pressure. NATO allies have demonstrated they will defend each other even against threats from Washington. Middle powers have seen that coordination works. That precedent matters. It changes calculations in capitals around the world. The next time Trump issues demands, allies will remember that resistance is possible. They will remember that unity provides protection. And this does not just affect the relationship between the United States and Europe. It affects how every nation thinks about power. If Europe can resist American pressure over Greenland, what does that mean for Asia? What does that mean for Latin America? What does that mean for any region where Washington has traditionally expected deference? The rules-based order might be over, as Carney said. But the chaos Trump hoped to exploit is giving birth to something else entirely. Networks of mutual defense, coalitions of middle powers, a multipolar world where dominance is harder to achieve and maintain. The economic implications of this are enormous. Markets hate uncertainty. When the President of the United States threatens military action against allies, investors move capital. Supply chains get reassessed. Risk premiums increase. The immediate market reaction to Trump's tariff threats was negative. Stocks fell, the dollar weakened. When he announced his framework deal, markets rebounded. But that relief was temporary because investors now understand that Trump's approach to foreign policy creates inherent volatility. And volatility has costs. Companies that were considering expanding operations in the United States are reconsidering. Trading partners that were negotiating deals are hedging their bets. Allies that provided diplomatic support are calculating whether alignment with Washington is worth the risk. This erosion of trust happens slowly, then suddenly. And once lost, it is incredibly difficult to rebuild. European leaders understand this. That is why Macron, von der Leyen, and others have been so vocal. They are not just defending Denmark. They are defending the principle that threats do not work, that sovereignty matters, that alliances require mutual respect. And Mark Carney gave them a framework for thinking about this moment, not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The old order is gone. Nostalgia will not bring it back. But from the rupture, as Carney put it, we can build something better, stronger, and more just. That message resonated because it offered a path forward. Not resistance for the sake of resistance, but the construction of new arrangements. Coalitions built on shared values rather than domination. Cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchy. The contrast with Trump's vision could not have been starker. Trump sees the world as zero-sum, winners and losers, dominance or submission. Strength is measured in the ability to extract concessions through threats. Carney sees interdependence, shared challenges requiring collective solutions. Strength is measured in the capacity to build coalitions and maintain them. One vision is rooted in the past, the other looks toward what comes next. But there is another layer to this story that we have not touched on yet, and it hits much closer to home. We have talked about Davos, we have talked about diplomats in suits, but what does this actually mean for you? For the American taxpayer? For the small business owner in Ohio or the retiree in Florida? Because it is easy to look at this as just political theater, a game played by elites in distant capitals. But the reality is that the consequences of this retreat are going to land right on your doorstep. When a president draws a red line and then erases it the moment things get tough, it does not just hurt his ego, it hurts the American wallet. Think about the leverage we lose every time a threat turns out to be hollow. The American economy is built on the global belief that the dollar is safe, that our agreements are solid, and that our leadership is steady. When that stability is replaced by erratic gambles, the cost of doing business goes up for everyone. If Europe had not unified, if those tariffs had gone into effect, we were looking at a trade war that would have spiked inflation overnight. The framework deal avoided that disaster for now, but the uncertainty it created is already pricing itself into the market. Companies are hoarding cash instead of hiring because they do not know what the rules will be next week. That hesitation kills growth. That hesitation kills jobs. I want to hear from you on this. Are you seeing this kind of hesitation in your own local economy? Are businesses in your area holding back because of this uncertainty? Drop a comment below and let us know what is happening on the ground where you live. And let us not forget who is watching from the sidelines. While Washington and Brussels were locked in this stare down, you can bet that Beijing and Moscow were taking notes. They are seeing a fractured West, yes, but they are also seeing a United States that is becoming increasingly isolated by its own choices. Mark Carney's vision of middle powers. Banding together excludes the United States just as much as it protects against it. If Canada, Europe, and other allies start building their own economic networks to Trump-proof their economies, where does that leave American exporters? Where does that leave American farmers who rely on those markets? We risk being left on the outside looking in, not because we were kicked out, but because we locked the door from the inside. This is the hidden cost of the America First strategy when it morphs into America alone. We assume we are indispensable, that the world cannot spin without us. But what we saw in Davos is that the world is starting to figure out how to do exactly that. They are building redundancies. They are creating workarounds. They are learning to say no. And once those new pathways are built, they do not just disappear when a new administration comes in. They become the new normal. We are trading long-term influence for short-term headlines. And that is a trade that rarely pays off in the end. Moreover, there is a psychological toll on the national identity. Americans are used to being the indispensable nation, the architect of global stability. Seeing a president have to publicly walk back a demand for territory, something that feels like it belongs in the 18th century, is jarring. It shatters the illusion of invincibility. It forces us to confront the fact that raw power, without the legitimacy of strong alliances, is a wasting asset. The military might is there, the economic weight is there, but the ability to translate that into results is evaporating because trust is evaporating. So, as we watch the dust settle on the Swiss Alps, we have to ask ourselves, is this the future we want? A future where our closest friends have to organize against us to protect themselves? A future where American leadership is seen as a liability rather than an asset? The rupture that Carney spoke of is not just happening out there in the world. It is happening to us. It is a wake-up call. We can continue down this path of transactional bullying and watch our circle of influence shrink. Or we can recognize that in the 21st century, true strength comes from being the partner that everyone wants to work with, not the boss that everyone fears. At Davos, the world saw both visions on display. One day apart, same venue, same audience, completely different approaches. Carney spoke to the future. Trump revealed his limitations. And that is the story that matters. Not the framework deal, not the tariff threats, but the demonstration that American power has limits, that threats can fail, that allies can resist, that middle powers, when unified, can constrain even a superpower. Trump went to Davos seeking to project dominance over Greenland. He left having retreated from his most extreme demands. He declared victory, but everyone who was watching saw the truth. Mark Carney did not confront Trump directly. He did not need to. He simply laid out an alternative vision. And in doing so, he demonstrated what leadership looks like when it is not based on intimidation. The coming months will reveal whether Trump's framework holds or whether this crisis reignites. It will show whether Europe maintains its unity or fractures under pressure. It will determine whether the precedent set at Davos becomes a turning point or just a temporary blip. But one thing is already clear. The world order is changing. Not through grand agreements or dramatic summits, but through moments like this, when threats fail, when allies stand firm, when leaders like Carney articulate what everyone is thinking but afraid to say, and when history looks back at this week in Davos, it will not remember Trump's framework deal. It will remember the Canadian Prime Minister who told the world the truth, that the old order is over, that nostalgia will not save us, and that from the fracture, if we have the courage to build together, something better might emerge. That is the real story. That is what actually happened. Thank you so much for reading along with me today. If this breakdown helped you understand the deeper meaning behind the headlines, please hit that like button. And tell me, do you think Trump's climb down will last? Or are we heading toward another confrontation? Let's discuss it in the comments.